Hospitals have always been places where life and death intersect, where the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond it seems to blur. The hospital where I worked was no exception. It was an old building, one that had stood for nearly a century, its long corridors and aging architecture carrying the weight of countless stories, some whispered in fear, others in awe. The most enduring tale in this hospital, the one that everyone knew, whether they believed in it or not, was the story of the ghostly nurse. The legend had been passed down through generations of staff, from the oldest doctor to the newest intern, and it had become a part of the hospital's identity, a haunting presence that loomed over the night shifts like a shadow. They said she was a nurse who had worked here decades ago, back when the hospital was first built. She was kind and compassionate, beloved by all who knew her, but her life was marked by tragedy. The story went that she had fallen in love with a young doctor, and for a time their love was the talk of the hospital. But something happened, something terrible, and she took her own life in one of the empty rooms on the top floor. Since then, her spirit had been seen wandering the halls, still dressed in her old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her face a pale reflection of the sadness that had consumed her in life. The stories varied, of course. Some said she appeared to comfort dying patients, easing their passage into the next world. Others claimed she was a vengeful spirit, seeking retribution for the wrongs done to her. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that if you saw her, it meant something terrible was about to happen. As a nurse, I had always been skeptical of such tales. We worked in a place where science and logic reigned supreme, where the unexplained was dismissed as superstition or the product of overworked minds. But as much as I tried to ignore the stories, there was always a part of me, a small, irrational part, that couldn't shake the feeling that there might be some truth to them. I wasn't always a believer in the supernatural. In fact, I prided myself on being practical, grounded in reality. My name is Claire, and I've been a nurse for over 10 years. I came to this hospital about 5 years ago, seeking a change from the hustle and bustle of the city. This hospital, with its quiet, small-town charm, seemed like the perfect place to settle down. Nursing had always been my calling. Even as a child, I was the one who bandaged scraped knees and offered comfort to those in pain. My mother had been a nurse too, and I suppose it was inevitable that I would follow in her footsteps. But it wasn't just about carrying on a family tradition. I truly loved the work. There was something deeply fulfilling about caring for others, about being there in their moments of need. But nursing was also a demanding job, one that required long hours and often left me emotionally and physically drained. The night shifts were the hardest. The hospital took on a different atmosphere at night, the bustling activity of the day replaced by an eerie stillness. It was during these hours that the stories of the ghostly nurse seemed most real, the shadows in the corners of the rooms taking on a life of their own. I had heard the stories from the moment I started working here. The other nurses would exchange knowing glances and lower their voices whenever they talked about the ghost. At first, I dismissed it all as nonsense, a way for the staff to entertain themselves during the long, quiet hours of the night. But as time went on, I began to notice things, small, inexplicable things that made me question my skepticism. It started with the feeling of being watched. I would be alone in a room, tending to a patient, and suddenly I would feel a cold shiver run down my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I would turn around, expecting to see someone there, but the room would be empty. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of fatigue and the eerie atmosphere of the hospital at night. But then there were the other things, objects that would move on their own, doors that would close by themselves, and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. These occurrences were always subtle, easy to dismiss, but they happened often enough that I couldn't ignore them entirely. Still, I tried to rationalize it all, to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything. After all, I was a nurse, trained to rely on evidence and reason. But deep down, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to the stories, if the ghostly nurse was more than just a legend. The story of the ghostly nurse was one of those tales that everyone in the hospital knew, though the details varied depending on who you asked. The most common version of the story went something like this. Her name was Mary. She had started working at the hospital shortly after it opened, back in the early 1900s. She was young, beautiful, and full of life, with a smile that could brighten even the darkest of days. She had a natural talent for nursing, and her compassion and dedication quickly earned her the admiration of her colleagues and patients alike. But it was her relationship with a young doctor named Edward that became the stuff of hospital legend. They had met shortly after she started working at the hospital, and it wasn't long before they fell in love. They were inseparable, the perfect couple, or so it seemed. But there was a darkness lurking beneath the surface. Edward, it was said, was not the man he appeared to be. He was charming and handsome, but he had a temper, a cruel streak that he kept hidden from most people. Only Mary saw this side of him, and by the time she realized the truth, it was too late. The details of what happened next were murky. Some said that Edward had been unfaithful, that Mary had caught him with another woman and had been heartbroken. Others claimed that Edward had been abusive, that he had hurt Mary in ways that no one else knew. Whatever the truth was, it led Mary to a place of despair. One night, after a particularly brutal argument with Edward, Mary was found in one of the empty rooms on the top floor of the hospital. She had taken her own life, her body discovered by a fellow nurse who had gone looking for her when she didn't return from her break. The hospital was never the same after that. In the years that followed, stories began to circulate about strange occurrences in the hospital. Patients would report seeing a nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, her face pale and her eyes filled with sadness. She would appear at their bedside, offering comfort in their final moments, only to vanish when they tried to speak to her. Staff members, too, reported strange encounters. They would hear footsteps in empty hallways, see doors open and close by themselves, and feel an unexplained chill in the air. But the most unsettling stories were those of staff members who claimed to have seen Mary herself, her ghostly figure wandering the halls, still searching for something, or someone, that she had lost. These stories became a part of the hospital's lore, passed down from one generation of staff to the next. Some believed them, others didn't, but everyone knew them. And for those of us who worked the night shifts, they were a constant reminder that the hospital was a place where the line between life and death was thin, where the past was never truly gone. As the years went by, the stories of the ghostly nurse continued to circulate, each new encounter adding another layer to the legend. Most of the stories were similar. A patient or staff member would see a nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, her face pale and her expression sad, and then she would disappear as suddenly as she had appeared. One of the most well-known stories was that of an elderly patient who had been admitted to the hospital for a routine surgery. The surgery had gone well, but the patient's condition suddenly took a turn for the worse during the night. The nurse on duty, a young woman named Sarah, had been the one to discover the patient's deteriorating condition. She had called for help, but by the time the doctors arrived, it was too late. Sarah was devastated. She had done everything she could, but the patient had died in her care. She blamed herself, even though there was nothing more she could have done. She was sitting at the nurse's station, trying to compose herself, when she felt a presence beside her. She looked up and saw a nurse standing there, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, her face pale but kind. The nurse placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder and smiled at her, a gesture of comfort and reassurance. Sarah blinked, and the nurse was gone. Shaken, Sarah asked the other nurses if they had seen the woman, but no one had. When she described the nurse, the older staff members exchanged knowing glances. They told Sarah about the ghostly nurse, about how she often appeared to comfort those who were grieving or struggling. Sarah didn't believe in ghosts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something, someone real. Another story involved a doctor who had been working late, reviewing patient files in his office. He had been at the hospital for hours, and the exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. As he sat at his desk, he heard a soft knock at the door. He called out for whoever it was to come in, but no one entered. The knock came again, louder this time. The doctor got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. Puzzled, he returned to his desk, only to hear the knock again. This time it was followed by the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable. The doctor walked out into the hallway, his heart pounding. He followed the sound of the footsteps down the hall, turning a corner just in time to see a figure disappearing into one of the rooms. He hurried after the figure, but when he entered the room, it was empty. The only sound was the faint echo of his own footsteps. The doctor stood there, his heart racing, unsure of what he had just witnessed. The next morning, he heard the stories about the ghostly nurse, and he couldn't help but wonder if that was who or what he had seen. Patients, too, had their own stories. Some claimed to have seen the nurse at their bedside, her presence bringing them comfort in their final moments. Others reported feeling a cold breeze or seeing a shadowy figure out of the corner of their eye. These stories were always the same, a fleeting glimpse, a feeling of being watched, and then nothing. Over time, I heard more and more of these stories, each one adding to the legend of the ghostly nurse. I listened politely, but I remained skeptical. I had never seen anything myself, and I was determined to keep it that way. But as much as I tried to ignore the stories, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The hospital was a place of healing, but it was also a place of death, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the two were more closely connected than I wanted to admit. It was a particularly quiet night when I had my first encounter. I was working the night shift as usual, and the hospital was unusually still. The patients were all asleep, the hallways were empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I was at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts when I felt it, that inexplicable sensation of being watched. I looked up from the charts, my eyes scanning the empty hallway. There was no one there, but the feeling persisted, a cold shiver running down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to do a quick round of the floor, partly to check on the patients and partly to reassure myself that everything was normal. I walked down the hallway, peering into each room as I passed. The patients were all asleep, their breathing steady and even, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step I took. As I approached the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door to one of the empty rooms was ajar, even though I was certain I had closed it earlier. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to turn around and walk away, but something compelled me to approach the door. I pushed the door open slowly, peering into the room. It was empty, just as it should have been, but there was something off about it. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and there was a faint, lingering scent of something I couldn't quite place, something old, musty, like the scent of a room that had been closed up for years. I stepped into the room, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the standard hospital bed and equipment. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper, like the sound of someone trying to speak but unable to find the words. I froze, my heart racing. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, but still unintelligible. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest. I squinted, trying to make out what was there, but the shadows seemed to shift and move, as if they were alive. And then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her figure barely visible in the darkness, but there was no mistaking her. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to reach out and wrap around me, pulling me into her despair. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if time had stopped, and all that existed was the two of us, trapped in that room together. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on hers. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The room was empty again, the shadows still and lifeless. The air felt lighter, the musty scent gone. I was alone. I stumbled out of the room, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been real, or had I imagined it? Was I just another tired nurse, letting the old stories get to me? But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen was real, that I had come face to face with the ghostly nurse. After that night, everything changed. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, a figure in the hallway, a shadow in the room, a flash of white that disappeared as soon as I turned my head. I couldn't prove that any of it was real, but I knew, deep down, that the ghostly nurse was there, watching me, following me. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. I didn't want to be labeled as the nurse who saw ghosts, the one who had lost her mind. But the fear stayed with me, growing stronger with each passing day. I began to dread the night shifts, knowing that I would be alone with her again, that I would feel her presence, hear her whispers, see her sad, hollow eyes. The other nurses noticed the change in me, but they didn't say anything. Maybe they had their own encounters, their own fears, and didn't want to admit it. Or maybe they just thought I was another overworked nurse, struggling to cope with the demands of the job. Either way, no one asked, and I didn't offer any explanations. But the encounters didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent, more intense. I would hear her whispers in the empty hallways, feel her cold breath on the back of my neck, see her reflection in the windows, staring back at me with those hollow, haunted eyes. I couldn't escape her, couldn't find any peace. As time went on, I began to understand why the ghostly nurse had become such an enduring part of the hospital's lore. She wasn't just a ghost, a figment of the imagination. She was a symbol, a reminder of the hospital's history, of the countless lives that had passed through its doors, both the living and the dead. The hospital was a place where life and death coexisted, where the line between the two was often blurred. It was a place where people came to be healed, but also where many came to die. And in that space, where so much suffering and loss had occurred, it was only natural that some of that energy, that pain, would linger. The ghostly nurse was a manifestation of that lingering energy, a spirit trapped in the space between life and death, unable to move on. Her story, her tragedy had become intertwined with the hospital itself, her presence a constant reminder of the past. For the staff and patients, the ghostly nurse was a source of both fear and comfort. She was a warning, a sign that something terrible was about to happen, but she was also a comforting presence, easing the suffering of those who were dying, guiding them to the other side. But for me, she was something more. She was a reminder of the fragility of life, of the thin line that separated the living from the dead. She was a reminder that, no matter how much we tried to ignore it, death was always there, waiting, watching. I never found out what had really happened to Mary, the nurse who had become the ghostly figure that haunted the hospital. The details of her story had been lost to time, and the truth had become obscured by the layers of legend and myth that had built up over the years. But I didn't need to know the details to understand the significance of her spirit. She was a part of the hospital, a part of its history, and she would remain there as long as the hospital stood. She was a reminder of the past, a warning for the future, and a constant presence in the lives of those who worked and stayed there. In the end, I had to accept that the ghostly nurse was real, that she was a part of the hospital's fabric, just as much as the walls and floors. I had to accept that I would never truly be alone in the hospital, that she would always be there watching, waiting. And in a strange way, I found a certain comfort in that. The ghostly nurse was a part of the hospital's identity, a reminder of its history and the countless lives that had passed through its doors. She was a symbol of the hospital's legacy, a reminder that even in death, there is something that lingers, something that remains. So I continued to work at the hospital, continued to care for my patients, even as the ghostly nurse watched over me. I never intended to become a doctor. It wasn't a childhood dream or a calling that hit me in my teenage years. Instead, it was a series of calculated decisions that led me down this path. Growing up, I was always the logical one in my family. While my siblings chased their passions, I followed the safest route, the one with the most stability and the least risk. My parents were proud of me, but they never pressured me into medicine. It was my choice, or at least that's what I told myself. The years I spent in medical school were grueling, and by the time I entered my residency, I was already questioning my decision. But by then, it was too late to back out. I had invested too much time, energy, and money into this career to turn around and start over. So I put my head down and pushed through, convinced that once I finished my residency and settled into a stable job, I would find fulfillment in my work. I eventually became a pediatrician, working in a small hospital in a town that was neither too big nor too small, just the kind of place I had always envisioned myself in. The work was challenging, but it had its rewards. Seeing children recover from illness and watching the relief on their parents' faces made the long hours worth it. But there was always a nagging feeling that I wasn't where I was supposed to be, that this life I had built was a result of choices made out of convenience rather than passion. The hospital itself was a nondescript building, functional but devoid of any real character. It had been built in the 1970s, and while it had undergone several renovations over the years, it still retained a certain coldness, a sterility that made it feel less like a place of healing and more like a machine designed to churn out patients. The pediatric ward was tucked away on the third floor, a place where the walls were painted in soft pastels, and the rooms were filled with stuffed animals and colorful murals meant to distract children from the reality of their illnesses. I had been working there for about 5 years when I first heard about the ghost. It was just a whisper among the staff at first, something mentioned in passing during a late-night shift. But as time went on, the stories became more frequent, more detailed, and it wasn't long before I found myself drawn into the mystery of the child who haunted the pediatric ward. The first time I heard the story, it was during a quiet night shift. The kind of night where the hallways were eerily silent, and the only sounds were the beeping of monitors and the occasional rustle of bed sheets as a child turned in their sleep. I was sitting at the nurse's station going over patient charts when one of the nurses, Karen, brought up the topic. "Have you ever heard the laughter?" she asked, her voice low as if she didn't want to be overheard. I looked up from the chart I was reading, puzzled. "What laughter?" "The child's laughter," she replied, glancing around nervously. "It's been happening for years, long before you started working here. It only happens at night, usually around the same time." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. You're talking about a ghost. She nodded, her expression serious. I know it sounds crazy, but I've heard it myself. And it's not just me. Other nurses' parents, even some of the doctors have heard it too. I couldn't help but chuckle. Come on, Karen. You're telling me this place is haunted by a ghost child. I know how it sounds, but I'm not making this up, she insisted. There's a story behind it too. They say it's a little boy who died here years ago. He was sick, really sick, and he spent a lot of time in this ward. He loved to laugh, even when he was in pain. After he died, the laughter started. People hear it, but no one ever sees anything. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I was a man of science, someone who believed in things that could be explained, measured, and quantified. But the way Karen was talking, the look in her eyes made me pause. She wasn't the type to make up stories or exaggerate for attention. If she was telling me this, it was because she genuinely believed it. Have you heard it recently? I asked, curious despite myself. Not for a few weeks, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But the last time I did, it was clear as day. It gave me chills, Dr. Reynolds. I've been working here for 10 years, and I've heard that laughter more times than I can count. And every time it's like the first time, unnerving, like someone's there with you, even when you know you're alone. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell her that it was probably just the wind or the old building creaking. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than just an overactive imagination. As the weeks went by, I couldn't stop thinking about the story Karen had told me. I found myself asking other staff members about it, curious to see if they had heard the laughter too. Most of them nodded solemnly, their expressions serious. They all had their own versions of the story, but the common thread was the same: a little boy who had died in the pediatric ward, his laughter lingering in the air long after his death. According to the stories, the boy's name was Tommy. He had been about 6 years old when he was admitted to the hospital, suffering from a rare and aggressive form of leukemia. His parents had tried everything to save him, but the disease was relentless, and despite the best efforts of the doctors, Tommy's condition continued to deteriorate. Tommy had spent months in the pediatric ward, undergoing painful treatments and spending long nights in the sterile, brightly lit rooms. But despite everything he was going through, he had been a cheerful child, always quick to smile and laugh. The nurses adored him, and even the most hardened doctors couldn't help but be charmed by his infectious laughter. But as the disease progressed, Tommy's laughter became less frequent. The pain was too much for him to bear, and his body was growing weaker by the day. In the final weeks of his life, Tommy was confined to his bed, his once bright eyes dull and lifeless. The nurses tried to keep his spirits up, bringing him toys and reading him stories, but it was clear that Tommy was slipping away. And then, one night, Tommy's laughter returned. It was unexpected, startling even, given how weak he had been. The nurses on duty that night heard it echoing down the hall, a sound so pure and joyful that it brought tears to their eyes. They rushed to his room, hoping to see him sitting up in bed, his face lit up with that familiar smile. But when they entered the room, they found Tommy lying still in his bed, his eyes closed, his chest no longer rising and falling with the rhythm of life. He was gone, yet his laughter lingered in the air, as if his spirit had one final burst of joy before leaving this world. After that night, the laughter continued. It wasn't heard every night, but it was frequent enough that it became a part of the hospital's lore. Some believed that Tommy's spirit had stayed behind, unable to move on because of the pain and suffering he had endured. Others thought that his laughter was a sign that he had found peace, that he was happy wherever he was now. But no matter what people believed, the laughter was real. Too many people had heard it for it to be dismissed as a mere coincidence or trick of the mind. And as much as I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. As word spread about my interest in the ghost story, more people came forward to share their experiences. Some were parents who had spent long nights in the pediatric ward, staying by their children's bedsides as they fought off illness. Others were staff members, nurses, doctors, even custodians, who had been working in the hospital for years and had their own encounters with the ghostly laughter. One mother, whose daughter had been admitted for a severe asthma attack, told me about the night she heard the laughter. It had been around midnight, and the ward was quiet. The only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional cough from a sick child. She had been sitting in a chair by her daughter's bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, when she heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle, like the sound of a child playing. At first she thought it was one of the other children in the ward, but when she looked around, all the other rooms were dark and the hallways were empty. The laughter came again, closer this time, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She got up and walked to the door, peering out into the hallway, but there was no one there. The laughter echoed off the walls, growing fainter and fainter and fainter, until it finally faded away. She told me that she had never believed in ghosts before that night, but after hearing the laughter, she was convinced that something supernatural was at work in the hospital. She didn't find it frightening, though more comforting, like the spirit of a child was still there, bringing a bit of joy to a place filled with so much pain and sadness. Another nurse, who had been working at the hospital for nearly 20 years, recounted a night when she had been alone in the ward, the other nurses having gone on their break. She had been checking on a patient when she heard the laughter, a sound so clear and loud that it startled her. She looked around, expecting to see a child running down the hallway, but there was no one there. The laughter continued, echoing through the empty hallways, and she felt a sense of unease settle over her. She wasn't scared exactly, but there was something unsettling about hearing a child's laughter in a place where so many children had suffered and died. She said that she had heard the laughter several times over the years, and each time it left her with the same feeling, a mixture of sadness and hope, like the child was reminding them that there was still light in the darkness. One of the doctors, a man who prided himself on his logical mind and refusal to believe in anything that couldn't be scientifically proven, reluctantly admitted that he had heard the laughter too. He had been working late one night, going over patient charts in his office, when he heard the sound of a child giggling outside his door. He ignored it at first, thinking it was just one of the patients wandering the halls. But when he stepped out into the hallway, there was no one there. The laughter continued, growing fainter as it moved down the hallway, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He followed the sound, determined to find the source, but no matter how fast he walked, the laughter always stayed just out of reach. He finally gave up, returning to his office, but the experience left him shaken, questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. As the stories piled up, I found myself growing more and more intrigued by the mystery of Tommy's laughter. I had always prided myself on being a man of reason, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. But the sheer number of people who had heard the laughter, people who had no reason to lie or exaggerate, made me start to wonder if there was something more to this story. And then, one night I heard it for myself. It was a quiet night in the pediatric ward, the kind of night where everything seemed to slow down, the air thick with the weight of fatigue and the faint smell of antiseptic. I was finishing up some paperwork at the nurse's station when I heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle, like the sound of a child playing. I froze, my pen hovering above the paper as I strained to listen. The laughter came again, louder this time, echoing off the walls of the empty hallway. My heart started to race, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through my veins. I got up from my chair and walked to the door, peering out into the hallway, but there was no one there. The laughter continued, growing fainter as it moved down the hallway, and I found myself following it, my footsteps echoing off the linoleum floor. The sound led me to one of the patient rooms, a room that had been empty for weeks. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle as I tried to steady my breathing. Finally, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside the window. The laughter had stopped, and the room was eerily silent, the air thick with the weight of something unseen. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the empty bed and the sterile smell of the hospital. I finally turned to leave, my heart still pounding in my chest, when I heard it again, a soft giggle, so close it felt like it was right next to me. I whipped around, my eyes wide as I searched for the source of the sound. But the room was empty, just as it had been before. The laughter faded away, leaving me standing there in the dark, my heart racing and my mind reeling. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally left the room, I felt a strange mixture of fear and wonder. I had heard the laughter for myself, and there was no denying it now. Something was haunting the pediatric ward, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. As the weeks went by, I found myself thinking more and more about Tommy's laughter. But it was more than just a ghost story. It was a reminder of the pain and suffering that had taken place within these walls, and the resilience of the children who had endured it. The laughter was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still light to be found. It was a way for Tommy's spirit to live on, to bring a bit of joy to a place that had seen so much sadness. And while it was unsettling to hear, it was also comforting in a way, like a reminder that the children who had passed on were still with us, watching over us. In the end, I came to accept the laughter as a part of the hospital, just as much as the patients and staff. It was a part of the building's history, a reminder of the children who had come before and the sacrifices they had made. There's a particular operating room in our hospital that carries an eerie reputation. Room 24, as it is clinically referred to, has been the source of whispered stories and unsettling accounts among staff for decades. Those who work in the hospital long enough have all heard the tales. Some dismiss them as pure imagination, while others hold fast to the idea that something beyond the normal realm is at play. The room itself is like any other operating theater, at least on the surface. The sterile, white-tiled walls, the harsh fluorescent lighting, and the ever-present scent of antiseptic create an environment designed for precision and focus. But there's an underlying atmosphere in room 24, a sort of electric tension that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end the moment you step inside. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the stories began, but they've persisted for as long as anyone can remember. It was during the hospital's early years, sometime in the late 1950s, when the rumors first started circulating. The room had been the scene of several tragedies, a string of inexplicable deaths during routine surgeries. Patients who were expected to make full recoveries would suddenly flatline, their hearts stopping without any apparent cause. Despite numerous investigations, no logical explanation was ever found. The room was thoroughly inspected, and all the equipment was replaced, yet the deaths continued. It got to the point where some surgeons refused to operate in room 24, and it was temporarily taken out of service. But the hospital was growing and every operating room was needed, so eventually room 24 was brought back into rotation. Over the years, the room's dark history faded into the background, but the unease remained. Nurses and doctors would occasionally report strange occurrences, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, equipment that malfunctioned without reason, and the sensation of being watched. The stories were never openly discussed, at least not in any official capacity, but they were passed down through the ranks, becoming part of the hospital's lore. St. Augustine's Hospital was built in 1948, a product of post-war optimism and the booming growth of the suburban landscape. It was designed to be a state-of-the-art facility, a beacon of modern medicine in a rapidly expanding community. The hospital's founders had grand ambitions, and they spared no expense in its construction. The building itself was an imposing structure, with its sleek, white facade and towering glass windows that gleamed in the sunlight. The operating rooms were a point of particular pride. Equipped with the latest technology and designed for maximum efficiency, they were intended to be the heart of the hospital, where life-saving surgeries would be performed daily. Room 24 was no exception. It was centrally located, adjacent to the surgical wing's main corridor, making it easily accessible for emergency procedures. For the first few years, the hospital thrived and its reputation grew. The surgical team was known for their skill and precision, and St. Augustine's quickly became the go-to hospital for complex procedures. But then, something changed. It started with a single case, a young woman undergoing a routine appendectomy. The surgery was supposed to be straightforward, but halfway through, her heart stopped. Despite the team's best efforts, they couldn't revive her. The incident was written off as a tragic anomaly, a rare complication that couldn't have been foreseen. But then it happened again and again. Each time the patient was in room 24, and each time there was no clear cause of death. The staff began to talk, and soon, the room was known as the death room. In an attempt to quell the growing unease, the hospital administration ordered a full investigation. Every inch of room 24 was scrutinized, from the ventilation system to the electrical wiring. The equipment was replaced, and the room was blessed by a local priest, but nothing seemed to stop the deaths. As the years passed, the deaths became less frequent, but the room's reputation never fully recovered. New staff members were warned about room 24, and many refused to operate there unless absolutely necessary. The hospital administration eventually stopped assigning cases to the room unless it was an emergency. It became a place of last resort, used only when there were no other options. But despite its grim history, the hospital continued to thrive. St. Augustine's remained a respected institution, known for its cutting-edge procedures and top-notch medical staff. The shadow of room 24 loomed over the hospital, but it was largely ignored, a ghost of the past that most preferred not to acknowledge. My journey to becoming a surgeon was not unlike that of many others. Long hours, relentless studying, and a deep-seated desire to help people. I had always been drawn to the idea of fixing what was broken, of making things right in a world that so often seemed chaotic and out of control. Surgery, with its precision and focus, was the perfect outlet for that desire. I grew up in a small town, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher. My parents were hard-working, practical people who believed in the value of a stable job and a steady income. They supported my decision to go into medicine, though I think they were a bit surprised when I chose surgery. My father, in particular, had always imagined I'd follow in his footsteps, working with my hands to fix cars rather than human bodies. But he never said so, and he was proud when I graduated from medical school. After completing my residency, I took a position at St. Augustine's. It was a good hospital, well respected, and I was eager to prove myself. The first few years were a blur of long shifts, complicated cases, and the constant pressure to perform. But I thrived in that environment, and I quickly earned a reputation as a skilled and dedicated surgeon. I had heard the stories about Room 24, of course. Everyone had. But I was too focused on my work to pay much attention to them. I wasn't superstitious, and I didn't believe in ghosts. To me, the stories were just that. Stories, the kind of thing people tell to pass the time during long night shifts. But then something changed. It started with small things, equipment that seemed to malfunction for no reason, strange noises that I couldn't quite explain. At first I brushed it off, attributing it to the stress of the job or the natural quirks of an old building. But as time went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. I began to dread operating in Room 24. There was something about the place that felt off, like a weight pressing down on my chest every time I stepped inside. The air was thick, almost stifling, and I found it difficult to concentrate. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get to me, but deep down I knew there was more to it. The first time I experienced something truly unsettling in Room 24, it was during a routine gallbladder removal. The patient was a middle-aged woman in otherwise good health, and the surgery was expected to be straightforward. I had performed the procedure countless times before, and there was no reason to believe this one would be any different. Everything was going smoothly until I made the first incision. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. I paused, glancing around the room, but the nurses and anesthesiologists were focused on their tasks, seemingly unaware of the sound. I shook it off and continued with the surgery, but the whisper came again, a little louder this time. It was indistinct, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay focused. There was no room for distractions in the operating room. As the surgery progressed, the whispering grew more persistent. It was as if someone was standing right behind me, murmuring in my ear. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible to ignore. My hands started to tremble, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. "Is everything okay?" one of the nurses asked, noticing my hesitation. "Fine," I replied, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. I continued the surgery, but the whispering didn't stop. It was relentless, like a constant hum in the background. By the time I finished, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves frayed. After the patient was wheeled out of the room, I stood there for a moment, trying to compose myself. The whispering had stopped as soon as the surgery was over, and the room was eerily silent. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. I didn't mention the incident to anyone. I wasn't sure they would believe me, and even if they did, I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge what had happened. I told myself it was just the stress, that I was overworked and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, it happened again. This time it was during a more complex procedure, an aortic aneurysm repair. The patient was an elderly man with a history of heart problems, and the surgery required my full concentration. I was in the middle of clamping the aorta when I heard the whispering again, faint but unmistakable. I clenched my jaw and tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was as if someone was standing right next to me, speaking in a low, urgent tone. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry. My hands started to shake, and I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't afford to lose my focus, not during a surgery as delicate as this. I took a deep breath and forced myself to concentrate, but the whispering didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the walls of the operating room. I glanced up at the surgical lights, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The nurses and anesthesiologists were completely unaware of the noise, their faces calm and focused. I finished the surgery, but it was one of the most difficult procedures I had ever performed. My nerves were shot by the time it was over, and I had to sit down for a few minutes to steady myself. The whispering had stopped again, but the memory of it lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing stories from other staff members. They had experienced similar occurrences in room 24, strange noises, inexplicable malfunctions, and the overwhelming sense that they were not alone. Some of them dismissed it as the stress of the job, but others were convinced that something more sinister was at play. I tried to rationalize what was happening, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the more I operated in room 24, the harder it became to ignore the strange occurrences. The whispering was the worst of it, but there were other things too, surgical instruments that would go missing, only to turn up in the most unlikely places, and lights that would flicker at the most inopportune moments. One night I was performing an emergency surgery on a young man who had been in a car accident. His injuries were severe, and time was of the essence. As I worked to stabilize him, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, as if the room had become a freezer. I could see my breath fogging in the air, and I shivered despite the layers of protective gear I was wearing. The whispering started again, louder this time, almost a shout. It was as if the room was filled with angry voices, all speaking at once. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out the beeping of the monitors and the steady rhythm of the patient's heart. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the scalpel. I could feel the eyes of the surgical team on me, their concern palpable, but I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge them. I was too focused on the voices, on the cold, on the sense of dread that was creeping over me. "Doctor, are you okay?" the anesthesiologist asked, his voice cutting through the noise. "I'm fine," I snapped, though I wasn't fine at all. I was terrified, on the verge of losing control. I forced myself to keep going, to finish the surgery despite the fear that was threatening to consume me. The voices were relentless, growing louder and more urgent with every passing minute. It was as if they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand them, couldn't make sense of the words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgery was over. The patient was stable, and I was able to step away from the operating table. But the voices didn't stop. They followed me out of the room, a constant, menacing presence that I couldn't shake. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't keep operating in room 24, not with the voices, the cold, the fear. But I also couldn't abandon my patients, couldn't let the stories get the best of me. I was a surgeon, and my job was to save lives, no matter what. But the more I operated in room 24, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The voices were getting louder, the cold more intense, and the fear more overwhelming. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going, how much more I could take before I broke. And then one night, it all came to a head. I was performing a routine surgery, a simple procedure that I had done hundreds of times before. The patient was a young woman, healthy and strong, with no underlying conditions. Everything was going smoothly until I made the first incision. That's when the voices started. They were louder than ever before, a deafening roar that filled the room. It was as if the walls were alive with sound, with anger, with fury. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, and I knew that something was terribly, horribly wrong. I tried to keep going, to finish the surgery, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the scalpel, and the voices were so loud that I couldn't hear myself think. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the room was closing in on me, suffocating me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The voices, the cold, the fear, it all vanished in an instant, leaving me standing there, trembling and drenched in sweat. I looked down at the patient and my heart stopped. Her eyes were open, staring up at me with a look of terror on her face. She was dead, her heart had stopped beating, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The surgery had been routine, there was no reason for her to have died. But she was gone, and I knew, deep down, that it had something to do with the voices, with the cold, with room 24. I never operated in room 24 again. I couldn't bring myself to set foot in that room, not after what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was cursed, that it was haunted by something malevolent, something that wanted to hurt, to kill. I transferred to a different hospital, but the memory of room 24 stayed with me, haunting my every waking moment. I couldn't forget the voices, the cold, the fear. I couldn't forget the look on that young woman's face, the terror in her eyes as she died on my operating table. I don't know what was in that room, what caused those deaths, those voices, that cold. But I do know that room 24 is a place of darkness, a place where something evil resides. And I know that I will never forget what happened there, no matter how hard I try.